Hey, everyone who's tuning in either from home or maybe just checking back in for a refresher after our lecture on Wednesday. You're all most welcome. I hope you guys are safe and able to enjoy a modicum of sort of comfort and fellowship with your various families. What I'd like to do in this video is sort of do the quick and dirty version of what I covered about Athenian democracy in lecture on Wednesday, and particularly to illustrate this core principle of Athenian democracy as a system that does and doesn't trust everybody within it before we get started with our own class democratic practice. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Feel free to pause or return to me as you need, and let's jump right in. Okay, this one. Yeah. All right. So when I was teaching Athenian democracy on Wednesday, the main idea that I tried to convey, both with Aristotle and a survey of a couple of different institutions, is this core idea. And I think it really picks up from where we left off with Lysistrata last class, which is that her play and her story shows us a system of leadership that does not want to put all its chips in one basket or all its chips on one leader, but rather to distribute power, to build coalitions, and to think more broadly about leadership selection. This is very much exemplified by Athenian democracy. And the core idea I want to illustrate is that Athenian democracy operates on a paradoxical principle. It is a government that, on the one hand, trusts that anybody can do the job of being a leader, but it also doesn't trust any one person to hold on to power for too long without being corrupted. So let's keep this paradox in mind as we think about a couple of different institutions. The Aristotle reading I gave you all was certainly a challenging one, but in his Constitution of Athens, he tries to map out how it is that a couple of different institutions worked, at least in his experience of 4th century Athenian democracy. Now, we're not going to talk about everything that he covered in that reading. For example, I'm not going to talk much about the courts, but we will touch in this little mini lecture on the concept of citizenship. What was the assembly? How did it work? What was ostracism as an institution for maybe marking out and removing dangerous people? And then we'll close with the concept of the governing council, or what the Athenians called the boule. So let's start briefly with citizenship. When we talk about citizenship in ancient Athens, I think it's worth pointing out that by our standards, by our, I mean Western, highly developed nation states, liberal democracy, we would not look at the Athenian concept of citizenship and find it particularly inclusive. In my little imagery here, you'll see that the characters who appear to be women are both saying, no, I'm definitely not an Athenian citizen. There are no women citizens. Similarly, immigrants and slaves who cannot participate, also slaves who gained their freedom, either through manumission or buying their own freedom, would never have the opportunity to be citizens. The only people who could be citizens were male Athenians over the age of 20 who could show that both their mother and father were members of native Athenian bloodlines. Now, what's kind of interesting about this is that maybe compared to our conception of, say, the American South in the 18th, 19th, even early 20th centuries, you couldn't always just tell by looking at someone, by their race, by their ethnicity, whether or not they were a citizen. Certainly, some old Athenian families had Egyptian ethnicity in their bloodlines, North African. So when I have my darker skinned looking citizens on this chart, I say maybe or possibly. If they were recent immigrants to Athens, then no, definitely you were not going to be welcomed as a citizen. But maybe if your family had, generations and generations ago come from North Africa or Egypt, but you could show centuries, generations of bloodline of Athenian heritage, you might be constituted as an Athenian citizen. So we are talking about a relatively exclusive group of adult men who have those bloodline ties. Now, even though this concept of Athenian citizenship, it's not very inclusive by our standards, I do want to point out that by the standards of the pre-modern world, this concept, though, that any male who can show his bloodlines is actually pretty radically inclusive. And what I mean by this is that if we look at other ancient civilizations, I'm thinking here of like Egypt, of Mesopotamia. I can't speak as much about like the sort of Carthaginians. We don't know very much. But what we see is that in many of these, especially Near Eastern societies, and even in comparison to Sparta, there were other requirements on top of being an adult male of bloodlines. Many of these civilizations required property ownership or a certain amount of wealth. I'm thinking here of like the Persian Empire, noble birth, right? Being certainly in Sparta, you have to belong not just to Spartan bloodlines, but to an elite class of Spartiates. Military resources, certainly in the Bronze Age, the ability to defend oneself with one's own armor, or perhaps, and again here I'm thinking of like the scribal classes of Egypt, access to education. So if we compare Athens to us, that concept of citizenship is maybe not very inclusive, but compared to other places in the Greco-Roman world and in the broader Mediterranean, vastly more inclusive. So when we think about an Athenian citizen, male and adult, really what we're talking about is a need to establish oneself as a citizen within one's own community and to have fellow community members recognize you as being from an Athenian bloodline. The importance of one's social network is something that is pointed out pretty dramatically by Aristotle in the reading we had, where he talks about in the beginning of the reading, the process by which one became a citizen. In the modern US, this might look like a green card process or your parents registering you at the hospital with your birth certificate. But in ancient Athens, this citizenship registration processed when young men were 18 years old. And you would go to your deme, which is just sort of a fancy word for your sort of village district or your immediate neighborhood. And you would be accompanied by other adult men, right? Members of your family who would present you, defend you, say, I have known this child since he was a youth, and I can attest that both his mother and his father are descended from good bloodlines. And what we see is that the members of the deme, I've highlighted this here, they vote under oath first about whether or not they think this person is in fact who they say they are. So it's not about documentation. It's not about having written proof. It's about having the buy-in of your community, right? Trusting the people of Athens to recognize one of their own. But as I said in the top of this lecture, the idea of mistrust, of not trusting people, is equally prevalent. And down below, we can see that the stick in contrast to the carrot. I'm going to go ahead and read this here. If it is decided that he has no right to be registered as a citizen, the city sells him into slavery. So if the people of Athens thought that you were trying to trick them, or if you didn't have upstanding community members to defend you, but you claimed to be a citizen, the punishment was incredibly harsh, not just to be kicked out of Athens, but to be sold into slavery, right? That's the mistrust part, right? Athens assumes citizenship is really valuable and wants to penalize anyone who would maybe claim to be a citizen without being one. Okay, that's all I'm going to say for citizenship now at the moment, that we've got for the ancient world a radically inclusive model, but one that relies heavily on social trust, right? And what I now want to do in this lecture is jump to what we know about some of the government institutions or the organizing bodies. In the Athenian democracy, we see organizing bodies that are somewhat similar to the institutions that we might think of as part of American representative democracy. Very loosely in comparison here, in the US, we have a legislative, a lawmaking body that has a large House of Representatives and then a small Senate, right? Just 100 senators for the entire country. Athens, too, has sort of a big and a small lawmaking institution, but they operate in pretty different ways from the way the US institutions do. If the US has a Senate as a tiny representative body, so too does Athens will have a council, although it's bigger than the US Senate. They had a rotating council of 500 people, and rotating because these people were randomly chosen. Now, this Council of 500 could not pass laws themselves, but what they could do was decide which issues the Athenian people should vote on, which offices needed to be filled, whether or not there was good administration of collecting trade taxes, maybe interactions with foreign peoples, particularly egregious acts of treason or major crimes within the city could be heard by the boule. So think of this as an organizing body for all the workings of Athenian democracy. But what I'm going to talk about now for the next couple minutes is the much bigger body, not of representatives, but an entirely direct democracy known as the ecclesia. On Wednesday, I asked the class how big the UVA football stadium is, and I think people said around like 16-ish thousand. Imagine being in an open air assembly or being in that stadium with half that many people, 5,000 to 7,000 Athenian men, and that when the city decides they need to vote on something or to pass something or to repeal something, it's not just representatives, but the entire group of 5,000 to 7,000 Athenian men who turn out. Now, there were a few simple rules at this assembly. First of all, you didn't have to go. And in fact, really hardworking or poor Athenians who couldn't afford to take a day off might not be able to go. Athenians who lived way out in the countryside might not be able to make the trip in. Think of the whole of Athens as being about the size of Albemarle County, right? So if you live way down south in Scottsville, like I do, it might take you a while to come in. But within that assembly space, it's actually a very free, radical democracy. If you attend and you're an adult male over the age of 20, a citizen, everybody is allowed to speak if they can get up to that platform and present. They all participate in voting. And the council who is running the meeting is going to be randomized every month, which means that you can't get a really corrupt council that decides that maybe they only want to talk about laws pertaining to the military, right? Every month, you're going to get a brand new council to ensure that all the needs of all different types of citizens are being discussed or being thought through. Now, I'm not going to do this discussion exercise that I did in class, but I would really encourage you to maybe pause me for a minute and think through to yourself, in a big open air assembly of thousands of people who are voting and speaking, what sorts of people are going to be effective and influential? And at least a couple of the suggestions we had in class, which are spot on, is that it's people who have good public speaking skills, right? Who can articulate their ideas, who are persuasive, who are charismatic. Which of course might present problems of its own, but it doesn't necessarily just mean rich and famous people. It's people with the ability to get their ideas across in a way that's persuasive to their peers. Okay, we're going to leave the assembly behind now, and we're going to think a little bit about councils and rotation. But one sort of stopgap measure I want to point out before we completely leave the realm of citizenry in the assembly is that the Athenians had a sort of backstop measure in case any one person was becoming too influential. To go back just one slide, let's think about this guy up here, maybe the guy on the top of the platform with the green looking toga, even though Greeks don't wear togas. What we might imagine is if one person really just outshone all of his peers, the Athenians had a system for removing that person. And that was that at any point in the year, the Athenians could vote about whether or not there needed to be an ostracism. And an ostracism is an all-citizen vote in which the Athenians could decide and put the names into a voting urn about whether one person had become too powerful and too dangerous and needed to be removed from the city. I joked on Wednesday, my mom is a member of her homeowners association, her HOA board in her neighborhood. And I know for a fact, there's a few people she would probably like to ostracize. I'm not going to name any names. But you can imagine that when you even think about American politics or other countries that have seen a lot of social upheaval, a method for removing, just for a short period of time, 10 years, someone who seems to be a really dangerous figure for the nation without actually finding them guilty of any criminal act or of stripping them of their property is a method of protecting the landscape of equality in Athenian democracy. All right, I'm going to spend my last few minutes, sorry, and these are a couple of examples of the potsherds, right? You write people's names down and you vote to kick them off the island. What I want to talk about as the last institution is this boule, this governing council. So the big assembly spaces where thousands and thousands of people come together to speak and to vote and to argue and debate, and maybe to ostracize somebody, but there still has to be some institution that organizes these votes and these debates and these conversations. Otherwise, it's pure chaos. And that is the organizing institution known as the Council of the 500, or the boule. And the really remarkable thing about ancient Athens is that whereas in the US, we decide who gets to go to the Senate by voting, the Athenians decided to put in their council people who were going to be randomly sorted, just like I've done to you guys in class practica. Members of the boule had to be over the age of 30, but they also couldn't be picked for more than twice in their lifetime. So the Athenians took the idea of like term limits really seriously. But it wasn't just a matter of like randomly putting everybody's name in an urn and shaking it up. The Athenians also worked to make sure that whoever was randomly put into the council every single month would come from different types of neighborhoods. And that would make sure that whether you lived in a rural community or an urban community or a coastal community, your needs would be heard. Oh, sorry, I went backwards. Let me go forwards. Here we go. All right, I know this chart is going to make your head hurt. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize it. But what I mean by a sort of randomization of geography is that the Athenians made sure that every single month, whoever was in that governing council, whoever was controlling the assembly agenda and the debate topics, were equally mixed between three districts: the city districts, the hill districts, and the coastal districts. And they labeled every single deme or village as either a city, a hill area, or a coastal area. And then they mixed all of these up randomly into tribes number 1 through 10, such that each of these 10 tribes would take control of the boule, the council, for 1 month each. But within each of those tribes would be a mixture of city people, hill people, and coastal people. I know this is going to make your head hurt a little, so let me try to use a slightly more American metaphor that might allow students to grasp what I mean. Imagine if once a month, a group of Americans all got a letter in the mail saying, "Congratulations, you've been chosen to be a senator," kind of like jury duty. "Please come to Washington, D.C. this month, and you are going to help organize our government." But imagine we didn't just bring all people from like Los Angeles or Denver. Instead, we made sure that all the people who were randomly selected were evenly divided between different types of territories. What this might mean is, say, in the month of January, we have 50 people who are randomly chosen from tribe LeBron James, 33% from Cleveland, 33% from Miami, and 33% from Los Angeles. I hope what you can perhaps imagine is that if we made sure that our senators were mixed up from different areas, it would prevent any one state or any one community from like overlording or corrupting the US government. You might have some Cuban Americans from Miami who wanted to look out for their interests. You might have some really progressive people from Los Angeles, and you might have some slightly more conservative Midwestern representatives from Cleveland. And then as soon as the month of January was over, all those people would go home. And then in February, we would bring in 50 more brand new people to run the boule. And let's imagine maybe they're Team Taylor Swift. We have 33% from Nashville, 33% from Rhode Island, and 33% from New York. Again, mixing up interests and territories, perhaps even sort of religious demographics or age demographics, to make sure that these group of people had to work together to do what was best for the whole United States and not just for their neighborhood or their kinds of people. It really gets at the heart of what I was saying at the beginning of this lecture. It trusts that anyone from one of these areas can do this job, but it also is skeptical that if we were to give all the power to people from Los Angeles or all the people from Rhode Island for a month, that they wouldn't get corrupted by that power and mostly just look out for their own interests. All right, I know that's a little confusing, but hopefully that gives you a sense of just how obsessive Athens was with making sure that power was constantly moving and that you were getting a really big assortment of different types of people from different walks of life and different areas of Athens. The very last institution I kind of want to touch on here has to do with the executive branch. In the US, we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the executive branch, right? Who's going to be our president for 4 years? I think you see that as well in a lot of modern liberal democracies, right? Prime ministers are really important. Chancellors, as in of Germany, are really important. But Athens really worked hard to make sure that its executive branch was not the most important or the most powerful one. Within their boule, their Council of 500, the choice of who was going to be the top dog, the executive, to make sure that everything happened the way it was supposed to, that was a job known as the chairman, or the epistates in Greek. And that role would rotate every 24 hours among the 50 people who had been chosen to run the government that month. Right. So again, think about like maybe we have tribe LeBron James down here. You can see all 50 people, but on every month, or sorry, every 24-hour period, you're getting one of those people coming and one of those people going in the role of president. I think for Americans, this makes our head spin. Like it just seems like complete chaos. But what it actually tells you is that the role of being the epistates, or the chairman, wasn't really that important. You weren't making like huge executive decisions that were going to change people's lives. Your job was just to be like the Mr. Buck stops here, right? To make sure all the forms got filled out, make sure things were running smoothly. And if there was some major crisis, that there was at least one person in charge burning the midnight oil to take care of things. But again, it gets at this concept of ancient Athens that any one of these 50 people could do this job. Anybody could be an executive for 24 hours, but we don't want to allow them to be an executive for more than that because we don't trust them not to become corrupted by that kind of power. All right, guys, I'm going to wrap my lecture up here, and I hope you were able to tag along in it. And I think what we'll pick up with next class is this core question of thinking about how is this a system that definitely invests trust in its citizens? And what does it also say about the way the Athenians thought about human nature and the dangers of human nature? All right, see you guys soon.